Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. After 47 years of marriage, I thought I knew every rhythm of my husband's life until one quiet morning, I stepped into my daughter-in-law's house and found his blazer on her chair, his shoes by her couch, and his father's watch beside a half-empty glass of wine. From upstairs, I heard her voice mocking me as too old to notice. In that moment, my heart broke, but I stayed silent, already knowing that the evidence I would gather would one day expose them all. I am Mary Collins, and this is the story of how betrayal turned into justice. It was a crisp autumn morning in Fairfax, Virginia. The kind of morning where the air smelled of fallen leaves and the sky carried that pale blue softness that only came in late October. I had risen early as I always did, slipping into my favorite cardigan and warming my hands around a cup of coffee before heading upstairs to fetch the gift I had hidden away. It was a silver bracelet I had found in an antique store downtown, delicate and old-fashioned with tiny etchings along its surface that reminded me of the jewelry I used to admire as a girl. I thought Anna would like it. She often made comments about vintage pieces, and though my relationship with her was never easy, I wanted to try. She was my daughter-in-law after all, and I had promised myself that for her 36th birthday, I would make an effort to be kind. As I wrapped the bracelet carefully in tissue paper and tied the box with a ribbon, I thought about my husband John. 74 years old, still stubborn as a mule, still rising before dawn, to attend what he called consulting meetings. He had been retired from his engineering work for years, yet he insisted on staying busy. I used to admire that drive. Lately, it puzzled me. We had more than enough saved, our house was paid for, our pension and his retirement fund, more than enough to live comfortably. Still, he left the house in pressed suits, cologne on his neck, a spring in his step I had not seen in decades. I tried to tell myself it was harmless. I looked around our kitchen, the oak cabinets that had held decades of family dinners, the table scarred by years of homework and arguments and laughter. David had grown up in this house, sitting at that very table, and now at 41, he was a successful attorney in Washington, D.C. He was chasing a partnership at Jefferson and Rowe law firm, a goal that consumed his long hours. He hardly saw Emma, his 6-year-old daughter, and though it worried me, Anna always insisted everything was under control. I wanted to believe her. I slipped the gift into my purse and grabbed my car keys. The drive across town was familiar, the streets lined with trees that were already turning red and gold. As I drove, I thought of my marriage, 47 years of memories with John. We had built a life brick by brick, survived recessions, illnesses, even the loss of friends along the way. He had always been my partner, my safe place, the one who steadied me. My chest ached with the thought that lately he had seemed like a stranger, but I shook it off. Today was about family. When I pulled into Anna's driveway, I noticed David's car was not there. Of course it wasn't. He would already be in the office preparing case files and staying late to impress his bosses. The front door was closed but not locked. Anna often said she felt safe in the neighborhood, that she didn't worry about doors or windows. I hesitated for a moment, then turned the knob and stepped inside, calling out gently, "Anna, it's Mary. I brought you something for your birthday." Silence. No sound of footsteps, no reply. The air inside the house felt strange, heavier somehow, as though I had stepped into a room that had been waiting for me. I closed the door behind me and took a step into the living room. That was when I saw it. John's navy blazer hung across the back of the chair, the very blazer I had bought him last spring for Easter Sunday. His polished leather shoes sat neatly by the couch toes pointed toward the hearth like they belonged there. On the coffee table lay his watch, the one his father had given him decades ago, its face glinting faintly in the morning light beside a half-empty glass of red wine. My breath caught in my throat. My knees threatened to give way. I stared at the items as if they might vanish if I blinked. Why would his things be here? He had left that morning in his gray suit, telling me he was off to a meeting. Why would his watch, his shoes, his blazer be sitting in my daughter-in-law's living room? My hands trembled, clutching the gift box so tightly the ribbon dug into my skin. Then I heard it, a voice drifting down from upstairs light and amused, carrying across the quiet house. She is too old to notice anything anyway. Anna. Her voice casual, laced with a cruelty that struck me harder than if she had shouted. The box slipped from my grasp and landed softly on the carpet. My pulse pounded so loud in my ears, I thought the sound might betray me. I pressed my back against the wall, forcing myself to breathe as her words echoed again, sharp as glass. She is too old to notice. I closed my eyes for a moment, steadying myself. The air smelled faintly of wine and perfume scents that did not belong together in this space. I knew in my bones that whatever was happening in this house was more than I could bear, yet I could not turn away. My life, my family, everything I believed in, hung suspended in that instant, teetering between denial and a truth too ugly to face. And then the stairs creaked. The sound of the staircase groaning under weight pulled me into stillness, every muscle in my body tensed as I pressed myself flat against the wall near the kitchen doorway. I could hear slow footsteps descending, each one deliberate and careless, and then he appeared. John, my husband of nearly half a century, came into view wearing only an undershirt and a pair of plaid pajama pants. His thinning hair mussed in a way I had not seen since we were newly married. His bare feet padded across the hardwood floor, the same feet I had rubbed with lotion after long work days years ago. I could not breathe. He looked comfortable at home, as if this living room was his own. He yawned, stretched, then settled into the chair where his blazer still hung. A moment later, Anna followed him. She had wrapped herself in a silk robe, one I had never seen before, the color deep crimson against her pale skin. She moved with an ease that made my stomach twist, pouring wine into the glass on the table, as if this was their morning ritual. I dared not move, watching them through the narrow space between the door frame and the wall. Anna curled into the arm of the couch, her robe slipping slightly at the shoulder. John leaned toward her, murmuring something low, and she laughed. The sound cut through me. It was not the polite laugh she used at family dinners. This was softer, warmer, the laugh of a woman who felt powerful because she was desired. They spoke of David then. John asked when he usually came home, and Anna assured him not until late, not before 6 or even 7. She added that he was buried in work at the law firm, trying to prove himself, trying to climb higher. John chuckled, and Anna shook her head with a smile that carried no warmth at all. She said David loved that firm more than his own family. My chest tightened at her words, a knife twisting deeper, because I knew my son worked so hard to provide for his wife and little girl. I wanted to storm into the room to scream at them both, but my feet felt nailed to the floor. My mind was a blur of images. John kneeling in our church to propose holding David for the first time, fixing the roof in summer heat while sweat rolled down his neck. All those years, all those memories crushed under the sight of him brushing his fingers across Anna's hand with the tenderness he had long since forgotten to give me. Anna poured a second glass of wine and set it in front of him. She leaned close enough for her hair to fall against his arm, and he smiled as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the room swayed around me. They spoke about schedules, about arranging their next meeting, about how careful they would have to be. And then Anna, her voice low but clear enough for me to hear, remarked that I had grown quiet in recent years, that I was so wrapped up in my garden club and church groups that I hardly noticed anything. John laughed at that, and the sound was a stranger's laugh. A wave of nausea rose in me, and I pressed my hand against the wall for balance. The house felt suffocating heavy with betrayal. My eyes burned, but no tears came, only a cold ache that spread through my chest. I had always thought that if such a moment ever came, I would collapse, that I would cry and demand answers. Instead, I felt frozen, as though a piece of me had already died right there in that kitchen doorway. They rose together after some time, Anna draping her robe tighter, John sliding his hand along the curve of her back as they ascended the stairs once more. The creak of each step echoed like a nail hammered into the coffin of my marriage. I did not wait for silence to return. I slipped out from my hiding place, careful not to disturb a single object. My eyes fell on the small gift box lying on the carpet where I had dropped it. For a long moment I considered picking it up, but my hand refused to move. That ribbon, that silver bracelet meant to show kindness, now looked absurd in the shadow of what I had just seen. I left it there on the table, unopened, a silent witness to the farce unfolding in that house. As I stepped outside, the air hit my face cold and sharp, yet it did nothing to clear the fog in my mind. I walked back to my car on unsteady legs, my vision blurred, though I still could not cry. The neighborhood looked the same as ever: children's bicycles in driveways, pumpkins on porches, neighbors tending their lawns. Yet everything felt different. The world had shifted under my feet. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles whitened. I sat there for what felt like hours, though the clock on the dashboard told me only minutes had passed. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the frantic rhythm of my heartbeat. At last, I turned the key, the engine humming to life, and pulled away from that house, leaving behind not only the gift I had meant for Anna, but also the last remnants of innocence in my marriage. The drive home was a blur, with the familiar streets now foreign. I passed the elementary school where Emma played, the grocery store where I had once shopped with Anna, the church where John and I had renewed our vows on our 25th anniversary. Each place struck me like a cruel reminder, a whisper of a life that was no longer real. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my body ached from the tension, and my soul felt heavier than it ever had before. Inside our home, everything was just as I had left it that morning. The coffee cup sat in the sink, the newspaper still folded on the counter, the scent of John's cologne lingering faintly in the hall. I lowered myself into the armchair by the window, the one where I used to read stories to David, and stared at the blank wall ahead of me. Hours passed like minutes. I sat there motionless, hearing the sound of my own breath, feeling the weight of betrayal pressing down. When John eventually walked through the front door at his usual hour, whistling softly as though it were any other day, I remained perfectly still. He leaned down, kissed my cheek with the same practiced gesture, and asked how my day had been. My voice, astonishingly steady, replied that it had been fine. He smiled, put away his coat, and disappeared into the kitchen. That night, lying beside him in our bed, I listened to his breathing steady and deep, as if nothing had changed. the moonlight streamed through the curtains, casting pale lines across the sheets. I kept my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, knowing that everything I believed about my marriage had collapsed, that my life as I knew it had ended in that moment on the staircase. My heart was silent, heavy, but somewhere inside a quiet resolve began to stir. It was the faintest spark, barely there, but it kept me awake until dawn. The phone rang the next morning while I was still sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. I stared at the name glowing on the screen. Anna. My chest tightened, but I pressed the answer button anyway. Her voice was sweet and warm, as if nothing had happened, as if yesterday had been just another birthday for her. She thanked me for the silver bracelet, said it was beautiful, said she had never received something so thoughtful. I listened in silence, knowing I had left that gift behind unopened. Somehow she had found it and wrapped her voice around it like a ribbon. Then she invited me to lunch. I should have said no. Every part of me screamed to stay away, but I heard myself agree. My voice was calm, almost cheerful as I told her I would be there around noon. After I hung up, I sat motionless for a while, the phone still in my hand, wondering what game she was playing. When I arrived at her house later that day, she greeted me at the door with a bright smile, her dark hair brushed to a shine, Emma tugging at her leg with laughter. She pulled me into a hug that felt staged, like something rehearsed for an audience. The smell of chicken salad drifted from the kitchen. She had set the table neatly, 3 plates, waiting Emma's cup decorated with cartoon characters, placed carefully in front of a booster seat. Anna moved with ease, pouring iced tea for us, cutting sandwiches into neat triangles, chatting about Emma's preschool crafts and the crisp weather. I sat quietly watching her, hearing the echo of her laughter from the night before in my head. Emma climbed onto my lap for a few minutes, showing me a small toy she had brought to the table. I kissed her hair and held her close, wishing with every fiber of my being that she could be protected from what was happening around her. When Emma wandered off to the living room with her toy blocks, Anna's expression shifted. She leaned forward across the table, her eyes soft with something that looked like concern. She placed her hand lightly on mine and said she had been worried about me. She said she had noticed how quiet I was lately, how sometimes at dinners I seemed distant, how I repeated stories more often than before. She smiled gently, tilting her head like a nurse addressing a patient. She suggested that maybe I should see a doctor just to be safe, just to check my memory. Her tone was kind on the surface, but every word was a blade. I felt my breath slow as I realized what she was doing. She was laying the foundation, carefully planting the idea that I was slipping, that I was no longer reliable, that I was fading into confusion. I stared at her, keeping my face still, forcing myself not to flinch. Inside fury pulsed through me, but I swallowed it. I answered softly, thanking her for her concern, telling her perhaps I had just been tired. She nodded as though relieved, as though she had done her duty by bringing it up. She patted my hand again and began clearing the plates. I sat there watching her back as she moved around the kitchen, hearing her voice float casually as she spoke about the importance of taking care of ourselves as we age. I wondered how long she had been rehearsing these lines, how long she had been preparing to present me as fragile, forgetful old. When she returned to the table, she smiled again, warm and perfect. She asked if I wanted dessert. I declined, saying I should be getting home. Emma came running back then, her little arms wrapping around my legs. I bent down, hugged her tightly, and whispered that Grandma loved her. As Anna walked me to the door, she spoke once more about how health was important, how sometimes we did not notice our own decline. Her voice was gentle, but her eyes carried a flicker of triumph. She believed she had taken a step closer to convincing David that I was slipping. I smiled faintly, thanked her for lunch, and stepped outside into the autumn air. My heart pounded as I walked to my car. The leaves rustled in the wind, sharp and brittle under my feet. I gripped the steering wheel when I sat down, holding it until my knuckles turned pale. I did not cry. I did not rage. I sat in silence, replaying her words, her careful tone, her false concern. I saw clearly now, this was more than betrayal. This was strategy. She and John were not only together, they were building a shield around themselves. If I spoke out, if I tried to expose them, no one would believe me. They would say I was confused, that I imagined things. Driving home, I forced myself to breathe slowly to steady my hands. The neighborhood passed in a blur of red and gold leaves, children laughing on sidewalks, the normal rhythm of life continuing as if nothing had shattered. Inside me, however, something shifted. I realized that I could not fight them with emotion. Rage and sorrow would be useless. If they thought I was too old to notice, then I would let them go on thinking that. I would nod when they hinted at my forgetfulness, smile when they pretended to care, and I would keep my silence. But silence would not mean surrender. As I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I knew with certainty that I would gather everything they underestimated me for. My memory was sharp, my instincts alive, and my determination deeper than ever. Anna thought she could fool me. She thought she could build her web of lies around me until even my own son believed her. I stepped into my empty kitchen, set my purse on the counter, and stood in the stillness. For the first time since yesterday, I felt the faint stirrings of control. I was not ready to confront them, not yet. I needed time. I needed to see, to listen, to collect. They would not see me coming. And for now, I would let them think they had already won. That night I sat in my chair by the window long after the lights in the neighborhood had gone out, my hands folded in my lap, my coffee cold and untouched. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. I could not stop the flood of memories pressing into me, little details that now screamed for attention, details I had ignored or explained away. It was as if a drawer I had kept locked in my mind had burst open, spilling everything at once. 2 years earlier, John had started talking about fitness. He claimed he wanted to take control of his health, that retirement made him restless, and he needed a routine. He joined a gym across town and came home with new sneakers and shirts that hugged his frame differently. He even bought protein powder and supplements, things I never imagined him touching. I told myself it was admirable, that perhaps he wanted to stay strong for our grandchildren. Yet I remembered how he left the house, freshly shaved, cologne dabbed on his neck, a spark in his eyes that had nothing to do with treadmills. There were the clothes, too. John had always worn plain shirts, neutral colors, but suddenly he was buying crisp button-downs in shades of blue and burgundy, even a leather jacket that made him look like a man chasing youth. When I teased him, he gave me a half smile that did not reach his eyes. I should have asked questions, but I let it go, clinging to the comfort of routine. The trips soon followed. He announced them casually at dinner, saying he had to visit clients in Richmond or meet an old colleague in Norfolk. He packed suitcases with practiced ease, kissed me goodbye, and returned days later with vague stories and receipts folded neatly in his wallet. I noticed the scent of unfamiliar perfume on his jackets more than once, but when I asked, he brushed it off with a laugh, claiming he had been in crowded restaurants. I wanted so badly to believe him that I did. Anna had been slipping into those days too. She would stop by with Emma, her smile soft, her tone affectionate. She would ask about our accounts, the pension John received, whether we had considered selling the mountain cabin in Shenandoah. At first I thought she was simply curious, perhaps worrying about her own future with David. But she asked often, her questions looping back in different forms. Once she pressed about whether John planned to leave David everything or if things would be split in other ways. I laughed nervously, not seeing her intent. Now the memory burned. The cabin had been our little retreat. We bought it when David was still a boy, a small wooden place tucked near the river. We had painted the shutters ourselves, shared meals by the fireplace. It was not grand, but it was ours. The idea that Anna might have been eyeing it, measuring its value in her mind, made me sick. Piece by piece, the pattern revealed itself. John's sudden interest in his appearance, his absences, Anna's probing questions, the way she inserted herself into conversations about family property. I realized with a clarity that chilled me that this affair was not new. It had been nurtured in stolen hours in secrecy, while I busied myself with my garden, my church groups, the quiet routines that had once been my refuge. Anna had studied me, studied my marriage, looking for weak seams she could pry open. She did not only want John's affection, she wanted everything he and I had built together. My mind returned to one night 6 months earlier. John had said he was attending a retirement dinner for an old coworker. He left in a tailored suit, the leather jacket folded over his arm, and he came home late the next evening, humming as he walked through the door. I had set a plate of food aside for him, but he barely touched it, his face glowing with the kind of satisfaction I had not seen in years. I pushed the memory aside, then convincing myself it was nostalgia. Now I understood. I rose from the chair and moved through the house slowly, each step heavier than the last. The hallway light cast shadows on the wall as I stopped outside John's office. That room had always been his domain, a place where he kept his papers, his financial statements, his computer. He allowed me to dust, but never to pry. Tonight the door was closed but not locked. My hand trembled as I turned the knob. The office smelled faintly of cedar from the old desk he had inherited from his father. Everything was neat files, stacked drawers, aligned. I hesitated at the threshold, a voice inside warning me not to invade his privacy. But another voice, louder and sharper, told me that privacy was long gone. Whatever vows we had spoken had already been broken, not by me, but by him. I pulled open the top drawer. Envelopes, neatly arranged statements, a checkbook balanced to the penny. My eyes moved quickly, scanning dates and numbers. A quarterly retirement account statement caught my eye. I unfolded it and traced the lines until one figure leapt from the page. A transfer of $20,000 had been made 6 weeks earlier to an unfamiliar account. My breath caught. I read it again, the numbers blurring my pulse, rushing in my ears. It was not our joint account, not David's, not any account I recognized. I flipped to another folder. Receipts spilled out, restaurant names embossed in elegant script totals that spoke of indulgent meals, bottles of expensive wine, hotel receipts with check-in dates that matched John's supposed business trips, sweets costing more for one night than I spent on groceries for a month. Each paper was another knife, each line, another betrayal carved deeper into my trust. I put everything back exactly as it had been, aligning the edges of the papers with care. I could not let him know I had seen. Knowledge was power only if he did not realize I possessed it. I closed the drawer softly and stood still in the dim light, listening to the silence of the house. From down the hall I could hear his snores rising and falling, steady and oblivious. My knees felt weak, but inside my chest something hardened. For decades I had been his partner, the quiet supporter, the one who trusted and forgave. He thought of me as predictable, gentle, perhaps too old to notice. Anna thought the same, but they were wrong. I was not broken. I was awake. I switched off the light and stepped back into the hall, my hand brushing the banister for balance. The house felt colder, but my mind was strangely clear. I walked back to our bedroom, lay down beside him, and stared into the dark. The numbers from that transfer burned into my memory. I would not forget. I would not forgive. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint edge of determination sharpening inside me, a thread pulled tight, ready to unravel everything they had tried to weave. The next morning I woke before the alarm, the first pale light stretching across the curtains while John still snored softly beside me. My heart beat heavy and steady the way it does when you already know a truth you can no longer run from. I slipped out of bed quietly, careful not to wake him, and made my way to the kitchen. I brewed coffee, though I barely touched it, and spread a notebook across the table. My hand shook as I wrote down the details from the statement I had seen. The exact transfer amount, the date, the unfamiliar account number, every digit I could recall with painful clarity. I added notes about the restaurant names and the hotel receipts, small fragments that together painted a picture I could no longer ignore. By the time the clock struck 9, I had resolved to find professional help. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could tell me if there was a way forward. I searched for family lawyers in Fairfax, my finger trembling as I scrolled. One name caught my eye: Patricia Harris. She was older with over 40 years of practice, and something about her description gave me a sense of steadiness. I dialed the number, and after a pause, the receptionist told me Patricia could see me that very afternoon if I was willing to come in. Relief mixed with dread as I agreed. Driving to her office felt surreal. The streets were familiar, lined with maples dropping gold and red leaves, but I felt as if I were moving through a world detached from the one I knew. When I arrived, the building itself was modest, a small brick structure near the courthouse, but inside it carried a quiet order. Lemon polish lingered in the air, diplomas hung neatly on the walls, and the magazines in the waiting room looked untouched. Patricia appeared from a side door, her silver hair swept back neatly, her posture upright and composed. She extended her hand and greeted me by name with a kindness that made me want to cry, though I held myself firm. She led me to her office, gestured toward a chair, and waited for me to begin. The words tumbled out. I started with the bracelet, the unlocked door, the clothes draped across the chair. I told her about Anna's voice drifting down the staircase, about John's figure emerging in undershirt and pajama pants, about the intimacy I could no longer deny. I moved through the memories of the last 2 years, John's sudden obsession with the gym, the expensive cologne, the tailored shirts that replaced his old ones. I told her about the supposed business trips, the vague explanations, the perfume clinging to his jackets. And then I spoke about Anna's questions, how she had slipped into my kitchen with soft words about our finances, the cabin in Shenandoah, our retirement accounts. Finally, my voice lower and steadier, I told her about the statement, the $20,000 that had vanished into an account I could not identify. Patricia listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving mine. She did not tap her pen, did not glance at the clock, did not sigh. She simply absorbed it all, her expression calm, her presence grounding. When I finished, silence filled the space between us for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and said that I had already taken the most important step. I had noticed. She explained that affairs often came with manipulation, that sometimes those involved would try to discredit the spouse they betrayed by painting her as forgetful, unstable, or in decline. She asked carefully if anyone had implied that I was losing memory lately. I told her about lunch the day before, about Anna's gentle tone, her hand on mine, her suggestion that perhaps I should have my memory checked. Patricia's expression did not change much, but a shadow of recognition crossed her features. She said quietly that what I described was a textbook form of gaslighting. She explained that if I were to expose the affair without preparation, Anna and John could claim I was confused or delusional. She leaned forward and said that to protect myself, I needed proof beyond question. Her advice was clear. I would need evidence that stood firm in court, not just suspicions or recollections. Receipts, records, photographs, phone logs, hotel bills, even witness accounts if possible. She told me she worked with a private investigator named David Chen, a man of integrity and discretion who had helped many clients in similar cases. His work was meticulous, his records admissible. She suggested I meet him soon, perhaps within the week, and that I be ready to provide dates, schedules, and photographs. She also recommended another step. She urged me to schedule a cognitive evaluation with a doctor she trusted, a psychiatrist named Sarah Martinez. She explained that the report would formally document my mental sharpness. If Anna or John later claimed I was confused, this report would act as a shield proof that I was competent, capable, and aware. I nodded, feeling both heavy and strangely lighter. Patricia then spoke about financial safety. She suggested opening a personal checking account separate from anything John could access to protect myself if funds suddenly disappeared. She told me to keep a handwritten log of everything I observed, every trip John claimed to take, every odd phone call, every unusual charge. She advised me not to disturb his office again, but to let the investigator do his work. Her words sank into me like stones, solid and undeniable. I realized that for the first time since discovering the affair, I was not entirely alone. Someone believed me, someone knew the shape of this kind of deception, and someone had given me tools. Before I left, Patricia handed me a card with David Chen's contact information and said she would let him know I might call. She reminded me not to confront John or Anna, yet not to change my routine, not to give them any reason to suspect. She said the strongest weapon I had was their assumption that I remained unaware. I walked out of her office into the crisp afternoon air and sat in my car for a long moment. The courthouse loomed nearby, a reminder of what might come. I dialed the number on the card. The voice that answered was calm and professional. He introduced himself as David Chen. I told him briefly what Patricia had told him to expect. I spoke of John's frequent trips, the hotels, the receipts, the statement. He asked questions efficiently. When did John usually leave home? Where did Anna spend her days? What kind of car did each of them drive? Did I know their preferred restaurants? He explained his fees in straightforward terms and said he would send a simple agreement by email. He asked me to prepare photographs and typical schedules to mark days when I suspected John and Anna might be together. He told me that patience was necessary, that sometimes days passed with nothing, but that eventually patterns always revealed themselves. When I ended the call, I sat still in the driver's seat, the card in my hand. Fear still lived inside me, but it no longer ruled me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a fragile edge of control. I started the car and drove home slowly past the park where David used to play baseball, past the grocery store where John and I once laughed about coupons, past the church where we had renewed our vows. Every memory pressed against me, but now they no longer drowned me. They sharpened me. Back in the kitchen, I set my purse down and opened my notebook again. I began a new page titled quietly in my mind. Evidence log. I wrote down today's date, the name Patricia Harris, the meeting time, and the steps she had given me. I wrote David Chen's number and a note about Dr. Martinez. The words on the page steadied me. That evening, John walked through the door at his usual hour, his tie loosened, humming as if he had spent the day honestly at work. He kissed my cheek, asked how my day had been. I answered, simply saying it had been quiet. He smiled and poured himself a drink. As he stood at the counter, his back to me, I sat at the table with my notebook closed and my heart calm for the first time in days. I knew then that I had taken the first step out of the fog. I was not powerless. I had allies. And though he believed he still lived inside his secret, I was already preparing to open every hidden door. 2 days later, I met David Chen in his office above a small restaurant on Main Street in Fairfax. The smell of stir-fry drifted through the walls, faint but comforting. He was younger than I expected, in his early 50s, with a calm expression and eyes that seemed to notice everything. He offered me tea from a pot on the corner table and motioned me to sit across from his desk. The room was lined with filing cabinets and photographs of his family, a quiet reminder that he lived a life outside of other people's secrets. He asked me to tell him again what Patricia had already shared. I repeated the details carefully, from the blazer on Anna's chair to the transfer from the retirement account. He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting notes in tidy handwriting. Then he explained how his work would proceed. He said he would follow John and Anna discreetly using long-range cameras documenting locations and times. He would collect receipts, cross-reference credit card charges, and when possible obtain phone records through legal channels. He explained that none of this was fast, that patience was required, but in the end, the evidence would speak louder than any accusation I could make. He laid out his fee structure again, the retainer of $2,000 and a daily rate. I had already prepared. I pulled an envelope from my purse, money I had saved over years from household allowances, small amounts I had tucked away without telling John. I placed it on the desk. My hands did not shake. He counted, quickly nodded, and slid the envelope into a drawer. David told me that the next 2 weeks would feel long. He said there would be days when I heard nothing, but that did not mean nothing was happening. He promised to call me only if urgent, otherwise he would prepare a complete report at the end of the observation period. I nodded, thanking him quietly, and left his office feeling both drained and strangely strong. The waiting was the hardest part. At home, I kept my face calm, cooked dinners, folded laundry, and listened to John hum as if the world had not shifted beneath us. He left for his supposed consulting trip, suitcase in hand, smiling as if he carried nothing heavier than paperwork. I wrote everything in my notebook, dates, times, even the shoes he wore. I noted the calls Anna made to me, the gentle suggestions that I should see a doctor for my memory. Each entry became a stone in the wall I was building inside myself. 2 weeks later, David called. His voice was steady, telling me he had completed his initial report and that I should come to his office that afternoon. My stomach twisted as I drove across town, though my hands stayed firmly on the wheel. The autumn air had grown colder, the trees nearly bare. The world looked stripped as though it mirrored my own unraveling. When I entered his office, he already had a folder waiting on the desk. He asked me to sit, then opened it carefully, sliding photographs across the table. The first showed John and Anna walking into a hotel in Arlington. His hand was at her back, her head tilted toward him in a way that betrayed familiarity. The date and timestamp matched one of his supposed Baltimore trips. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep my eyes steady. The next photo showed them leaving the same hotel the following morning, John carrying a garment bag, Anna in a dress I had never seen her wear at family dinners. Another photo captured them at a jewelry store in Tyson's Corner, John leaning over the counter as the clerk displayed a diamond necklace. The receipt that followed confirmed the purchase several $1,000s charged to the very card I used weekly for groceries. David turned a page and revealed hotel invoices, each with John's name, each aligned perfectly with the days he claimed to be traveling for work. The amounts were extravagant, more than enough to shatter any excuse of business necessity. There were also restaurant receipts, candlelit dinners in downtown D.C., wine lists that carried prices higher than our monthly utility bill. Finally, he placed a document on the desk, a summary of phone logs. Over 400 calls between John and Anna in the past 6 months, some lasting only seconds, others nearly an hour, spread across every day and night. I stared at the numbers, at the undeniable trail of their connection, and felt something inside me shift. The wound was raw, but there was power in seeing the truth laid out with ink and paper. David paused, then his expression growing more serious. He slid one final photograph toward me. It showed Anna entering a small medical clinic, her coat pulled tightly around her, her hair tucked under a scarf. He handed me the printed record of the office she visited. It was an obstetrics and gynecology practice. The room tilted slightly, and I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. I asked him if he knew why she was there. He said quietly that he could not confirm that he had not followed inside, but that the nature of the clinic suggested possibilities that were difficult to ignore. He told me he would continue to watch, that if she returned, he would document it again. I sat very still, the folder open before me, photographs and receipts and logs spread like the shattered pieces of a mirror. Each image reflected a life I had not chosen, a betrayal too large to deny. And yet in the middle of the storm, I felt an unexpected calm. They had built their deception on the belief that I was blind, but here in my hands lay proof that could not be erased with gentle smiles or whispered lies. I thanked David, my voice steady, though my hands trembled when I gathered the folder. He told me to take my time to look through everything at home and to call him if I needed further support. I nodded and rose slowly, the weight of the folder heavy against my chest, as I walked out of the office and into the cold afternoon air. The sky hung gray above me, clouds thickening like a lid. I drove home without turning on the radio, each red light stretching into eternity. When I parked in the driveway, I sat for a long moment, the folder beside me, my breath fogging the windshield. Inside those pages lived the truth of my marriage and the path of my next steps. I carried it into the house, set it on the kitchen table, and rested my hand on the cover. My life had changed forever, but I was no longer stumbling in darkness. Now I had evidence, and evidence had power. The morning after meeting with David Chen, I woke with a sense of heaviness that clung to me through breakfast. The folder of photographs and receipts sat in my closet, hidden beneath sweaters, but its presence filled the house. I carried the weight of knowledge in every step, and yet I moved through the day with the same routines John expected. I folded laundry, answered a call from the church committee, and wrote down notes in my logbook. Each ordinary act steadied me, but underneath I felt a current of steel forming. That evening, a message came from Anna inviting me to Sunday dinner at their townhouse. She said Emma had asked for me, and she added a heart at the end of the message. I stared at the screen knowing what she was doing. Still, I typed back that I would be there. By 6 o'clock on Sunday, I was at their door, the air outside crisp with late November cold. Emma greeted me first, rushing into my arms, her small hands warm on my cheeks. Behind her, Anna smiled brightly, apron tied at the waist, and David came down the hall loosening his tie. John was already seated at the table, a glass of wine in hand, his face arranged in the practiced calm I had come to recognize as his mask. The roast was on the table, potatoes, steaming salad tossed. It looked like family. We began dinner with the usual chatter. Emma spoke about her art project at school. David mentioned a difficult case in Washington, and Anna refilled glasses with practiced ease. I listened, nodding, answering when spoken to. But I felt the waiting in the air, the way someone waits for a cue. It came as Anna leaned slightly toward David, her tone casual. She said how sweet it was when I told the same garden story twice last week, laughing softly, calling it endearing. She looked at David as she spoke, her eyes gleaming with the softness of someone who pretends to care. My fork paused, but I lifted it again, cutting meat, chewing steadily. Moments later, she added another comment. She told David that I had called Emma by the neighbor's name at the park, that it had worried her a little, though she brushed it off with a smile. David looked at me with a furrow between his brows. He asked gently if I had been sleeping well, if maybe I was stressed. My heart clenched at the worry in his voice. I wanted to tell him everything, but I knew I could not yet. Anna poured more wine into John's glass and let out a small laugh, saying that at last Sunday's dinner I had asked what time church began, even though I had attended the same service for years. She tilted her head as if amused, her voice wrapped in false affection. John cleared his throat but said nothing. David's fork slowed again, his eyes on me searching. I let the silence hold a moment before I spoke. I told them that I had been to see a doctor last week, a specialist named Dr. Sarah Martinez. I explained that she had run a full cognitive evaluation test for memory and reasoning, and that the results were excellent. I said she had given me a written report for my records. My tone was light, almost casual, as if I were simply sharing a piece of news. David's face shifted instantly, relief softening his features. He asked if the visit had made me feel more at ease. I said yes, very much so. Anna kept her smile in place, but her fingers tightened on her wine glass. She asked sweetly what kind of tests I had done. I explained that they included memory recall, problem solving, and attention exercises, and that I had passed them without issue. John sprinkled salt on his potatoes and stared at his plate, saying nothing. The conversation moved on, but the current underneath had changed. David spoke about his case again, his voice steadier now. Emma giggled and asked her grandfather to help her with the fork for the living room cushions after dinner. Anna cleared plates with practiced hands, and I stood to help. In the kitchen, she rinsed a dish and told me how glad she was that the appointment went well. She added almost idly that psychiatrists were hard to book these days, and that it was lucky I had found one so quickly. I told her that Patricia Harris had helped me secure the appointment. The plate clinked sharply against the sink before she steadied it. She said that was nice, and I answered that yes, it was. When we returned to the living room, Emma had constructed a blanket tent. John crouched beside her, grateful for the distraction, while David stood nearby with his hands in his pockets, watching. His eyes met mine, full of something tender, almost protective. For a moment I saw the boy he had been searching his mother's face for reassurance. I gave a small nod, and he nodded back an understanding, passing between us that Anna could not touch. Dessert followed apple pie warm with cinnamon. Emma demanded extra ice cream, which David allowed with a laugh. Conversation circled around ordinary topics. Anna praised Emma's drawing. John asked about a neighbor's new car, and I listened quietly. But I kept one hand resting near my purse where Dr. Martinez's letter lay folded. I did not need to pull it out tonight. It was enough that they knew it existed. When the evening ended, Emma hugged me tightly at the door, whispering that she wanted me to come back soon. Anna handed me a small container of leftovers, her smile wide but her eyes sharp. John kissed my cheek with the practiced gesture of a husband playing his role. David lingered a moment, asking softly if I felt all right to drive home. I told him yes, and that I would call him later in the week to arrange time with Emma. He smiled, his shoulders easing. Outside, the night air was cold enough to sting my cheeks. I walked slowly to the car, the container of leftovers in one hand, my purse heavy on the other arm. I sat behind the wheel and let the silence wrap around me. I touched the edge of the folded letter without taking it out. Inside the house behind me, Anna might be washing dishes and replaying every word I had spoken, realizing that her careful picture of me was beginning to crack. I started the engine and drove through quiet streets, the bare trees stark against the sky. At a red light, I breathed deeply, my shoulders loosening at last. They had tried to make me doubt myself, to seed worry in my son's mind, but tonight I had planted something stronger. Proof calm and undeniable sat in my purse, and I knew that the story Anna wanted to tell about me was already slipping from her grasp. The following Tuesday, I was trimming the last of my roses when I saw Lisa Moore walking up the driveway with her coat buttoned against the cold. She waved a little hesitant, and I put down my shears to greet her. Lisa had been my neighbor for nearly 15 years, a woman I trusted for her plain honesty. She glanced toward the street before lowering her voice. She said she hated to bring gossip, but thought I needed to know that she had noticed John's car at Anna's townhouse more times than made sense. Her brow furrowed as she explained that it was not just once or twice, but often sometimes during the day when David was at work, sometimes in the evening when the blinds were drawn, but the lights were on. My hands felt cold even though I wore gloves, but I kept my expression calm. I thanked her, told her I appreciated her candor, and promised her I would keep it between us. She touched my arm and said if I ever needed her to say what she had seen, she would. That promise lingered in the air like a lifeline. On Sunday, I went to service at our church, as I always had. The sanctuary was full of familiar faces, and I slid into the pew beside women I had known since choir practice 20 years ago. The hymns lifted into the rafters, steady and familiar, but my chest felt tight. When Pastor James stepped to the pulpit, his sermon focused on family loyalty and the blessing of faithful wives. His words drifted, but what pierced me came later when he asked the congregation to thank those who gave so much of themselves quietly at home. He looked directly at Anna in the second pew and spoke of her devotion as a daughter-in-law, how she cared for her husband's parents with kindness and patience. People nodded, some turned toward her with smiles, and Anna lowered her eyes with a modest grin that belied the sharpness I knew lived beneath. I felt the warmth around her, the unspoken judgment pressing against me like a wall. My hands trembled where they rested on my Bible, but I forced them still. I could not correct their picture yet. To do so without proof would be to play directly into her plan. After service, women crowded around Anna, praising her, telling her how lucky David was. I stood on the edge of the circle, the outsider, in a story no one knew was false. When Anna caught my eye, she gave me a small smile, the kind that seemed gracious to others, but carried a message meant only for me. It stung, but I held my chin high and moved toward the door. Lisa intercepted me near the coat rack and whispered that I was not alone, that some people saw more than they said. I nodded, grateful for the quiet reinforcement, and walked out into the winter sun. The days that followed grew heavy. At the grocery store, I overheard two women chatting about how Anna seemed to carry the family on her back, how lucky John and I were to have her. They said it without malice, but each word cut deep. I went home, set down the bags, and opened the folder from David again. The photographs, the receipts, the phone logs, all of it reminded me that reality lived in my hands, even if the community did not yet see it. Lisa stopped by again midweek with a basket of apples from her cousin's farm. She sat with me at the kitchen table while I peeled one for us to share. She told me gently that she had seen John leaving Anna's townhouse late one evening, his jacket unbuttoned, his face flushed. She had been walking her dog and nearly crossed paths with him. She said she turned quickly so he would not feel embarrassed, but she could not shake the image. I swallowed hard and told her I was grateful. She leaned forward and said again that if I needed her to speak on my behalf someday, she would. I believed her. I carried Lisa's words with me to the next Sunday service. Pastor James shook my hand warmly and asked after my health, his kindness genuine. Yet I could not forget how easily the room had been swept into admiration for Anna. I sat through hymns and prayers, feeling the distance between how people saw me and who I knew myself to be. Anna glided down the aisle afterward, her hand on David's arm, her smile radiant. People stepped aside to let her pass, murmuring kind things. I walked out quietly, letting the cold air sting my face, grounding me in silence. That afternoon, I sat in my kitchen with my notebook open. I wrote Lisa's observations, the dates she had mentioned, the times of day. I added the words church praise and circled them, a reminder of how Anna was shaping the narrative in the community. Every entry became another piece of the puzzle I would one day lay out on the table. In the evening, I called Patricia Harris and told her about Lisa's willingness to speak if needed. Patricia's voice carried approval. She said that community witnesses often played an important role, especially when the opposing party tried to build a false image. She reminded me to keep all records safe and to continue documenting. She assured me that when the time came, the strength of testimony and evidence together would be undeniable. I thanked her, hung up, and closed my notebook with hands steadier than they had been in days. Lisa's loyalty and Pastor James's unwitting praise for Anna lived side by side in my mind, one sharp, one soft, both pushing me forward. I understood more than ever that silence was not weakness, it was strategy. Each day of patience laid another brick in the foundation of the truth I would one day reveal. When I went to bed that night, the folder was still hidden in my closet, but I no longer felt it pressing on me like a weight. It had become something else, not a burden, but a shield proof that when the tide turned, I would not stand alone. And with Lisa's words echoing in my ears, I closed my eyes, knowing that the community's whispers were only temporary, that the day of reckoning was drawing closer with every breath I took. That night after Lisa left, I sat alone in the living room with only the ticking of the clock for company. I felt the ache of isolation loosening its grip, replaced by a new determination. When I closed my eyes, I saw Anna's smile, too smooth, too careful, and John's silence beside her. I knew if I wanted to outmaneuver them, I would need more than suspicion and whispers. I needed the kind of truth that printed itself in ink, that could not be washed away with a laugh or an excuse. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen counter staring at my phone until I finally pressed Anna's number. My voice was light, a little uncertain the way she expected me to sound. I told her I had been sorting through my calendar and had gotten mixed up about which doctors belonged to whom. I asked if she had ever seen Dr. Martinez, the psychiatrist Patricia had recommended to me, because I thought I remembered her mentioning it. I let a nervous chuckle slip through as if embarrassed by my confusion. Anna was quick. She said no. She had not seen that doctor, only her usual physician for routine checkups. She added that she had popped into a downtown clinic for a cough and that she almost forgot to mention it. Her tone was warm, casual, but I caught the edge beneath it, a sharpened care in the way she shaped her words. She asked if I was feeling all right and offered to drive me to my next appointment. I thanked her kindly, said I was fine, and promised to share a new lemon bar recipe with her soon. She laughed brightly, and we hung up as if we had spoken only of sweets and errands. I set the phone down and let the silence spread. She had covered herself with the word routine, but it rang hollow. My pen moved across my notebook, recording the call, her denial, her mention of a cough the time of day. I underlined the word routine twice. That evening, David Chen called. His voice was steady, his manner professional, but I could hear the weight of what he carried. He said he had obtained a copy of a billing statement from the clinic Anna had visited. The charges were plain pregnancy test panel, prenatal blood work, and an ultrasound deposit. The invoice bore her name, and the date matched perfectly with the weekend John claimed he was in Baltimore. The breath caught in my throat. I asked him to repeat the details. He did each word deliberate, each number exact. He added that surveillance had placed Anna at the clinic 3 times in 2 weeks, and that phone logs showed several short calls with John around those visits. He reminded me he could not confirm outcomes, only provide evidence. I thanked him and told him I would pick up the documents in person the next day. After the call, I sat at the dining room table and stared at the pattern of blue flowers on the cloth. I thought about Emma, about her laughter when she played under a blanket fort, about the way she said my name with such trust. The idea that her mother might be carrying a child not of my son but of my husband made my stomach turn. My hand pressed hard against the table as if to keep myself anchored. The next morning I drove to David's office. He handed me a thin envelope and reminded me to keep it secure. Inside were photographs of Anna entering and leaving the clinic, a copy of the invoice, and notes linking the visits to John's supposed trip. His handwriting was neat, controlled, leaving no room for doubt. I placed the envelope in my bag and thanked him quietly. Back home, I opened the folder I kept hidden in the closet and created a new divider marked Clinic. I slipped the papers inside and smoothed them down with careful fingers. Then I wrote a fresh entry in my notebook, noting the alignment of dates and the contradiction to John's story. At the bottom of the page, I wrote, "Protect the record. Do not confront." That evening, John came home humming, his face open, his hands relaxed. He kissed my cheek and asked if I had saved soup from the day before. I heated it for him while he spoke about a neighbor's fence and his plan to check the cabin in the mountains next weekend. His voice was easy, untroubled. I said I would see if I was free to join. He nodded, pleased with my answer, unaware of the papers resting less than 10 feet away that carried his secret. When the house was quiet and his snores filled the bedroom, I lay awake staring at the faint crack in the ceiling paint. I thought about timelines about the way weeks overlapped like threads. I calculated how long ago the pregnancy tests would have been taken, how easily the truth could be hidden behind the story of a cough. I thought about David, my son, the man who trusted both his father and his wife. I wondered how his face would change when the truth came to him, and the thought made my chest ache. The next day, I went to the bank and rented a safe deposit box. I placed inside it copies of the documents, the letter from Dr. Martinez, and a flash drive with scanned images of every piece of evidence I had gathered. The clerk asked if anyone else should be listed on the account. I told her no. For now, it was mine alone. When I returned home, the house smelled faintly of John's cologne. He had left early for another meeting. I set the keys to the deposit box in a small dish by the sink and stood there for a long moment. Outside the window, a pair of cardinals perched on the bare branches of the maple. The female was muted steady in her color, while the male flashed red before darting away. I watched them until they disappeared into the gray sky. Then I turned back to my kitchen table, laid my hand on the folder, and breathed. I had the call. I had the invoice. I had the photographs. The truth was no longer rumor or suspicion. It lived on paper, undeniable, waiting for the day I would place it on the table in front of them all. Thanksgiving approached with the smell of wood smoke in the air and the trees stripped bare along the streets of Fairfax. While neighbors decorated porches with gourds and hay bales, I spent my mornings at the dining table with Patricia Harris and David Chen, the folder of evidence spread between us. Patricia went over each document carefully, marking what carried the strongest weight in court and what would make the deepest impression if placed in front of the family. Chen added notes on the surveillance timeline, matching dates to receipts and phone logs until the pattern was too tight to ignore. I listened, asked questions, and in the quiet moments between their words, I imagined the faces of my family when the truth finally sat on the table. By the week of Thanksgiving, the plan had hardened into something that could not be shaken. I told David I would bring dessert. I told Anna I was looking forward to her turkey the way she always seasoned it, just right. She sounded pleased, her voice smooth and confident, and I could almost hear the triumph beneath her words. I ended the call politely and hung up with my hand steady. On the morning of the holiday, I baked 2 pies, 1 pumpkin and 1 pecan, the kitchen filling with the warm scent of cinnamon and sugar. I wrapped the pies carefully, slid the thick envelope of evidence into my handbag, and locked the house behind me. The drive across town felt dreamlike. Lawns were dotted with cars, houses filled with family laughter, but in my car there was only silence. When I arrived, Anna greeted me with a bright smile, her apron dusted with flour, her hands open in welcome. David appeared behind her, carrying Emma on his hip. My granddaughter's face lit up when she saw me, and she reached for me with a squeal. I held her close, breathing in the sweet smell of her hair, grounding myself in her innocence. John was already there. He stood near the fireplace with a glass in his hand, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. When his eyes met mine, something flickered, and he looked away quickly, turning toward the window as if the street held his interest. The table was dressed beautifully with autumn leaves and tall candles. Anna moved gracefully around the kitchen, checking the turkey stirring gravy, her voice light as she asked David about work. I watched the way she glanced toward John, a look so quick most would miss it, but I saw. It was not the look of a daughter-in-law toward her father-in-law. It was a glance of alignment, of secrecy, of confidence in a shared deception. John caught it and lowered his gaze, fumbling with his cuff as if it needed adjustment. I sat in the living room with Emma building towers of blocks, while conversation drifted from the kitchen. David spoke about a client in Washington, and Anna responded with soft laughter, leaning closer to John than seemed natural. Each word sharpened my focus. On the surface, it was the picture of a perfect holiday. The scent of roasted turkey filled the air, football murmured from the television in the background, and Emma giggled as her tower collapsed in a clatter. But beneath it all, I felt the storm building. I excused myself to the bathroom and stood at the sink looking at my reflection in the mirror. My face carried lines of years and grief, but my eyes were steady. I touched my purse where the envelope rested. Inside it were photographs of John and Anna entering hotels' invoices from the clinic credit card statements, and the letter from Dr. Martinez certifying my sharp memory. Every piece was arranged, ready to be revealed. When I returned to the dining room, the turkey was carved and the table full. David poured wine, Anna set down the gravy boat, and John pulled out a chair for Emma. I slid into my seat, folding my hands in my lap. Conversation swirled light and ordinary, but I listened to every word with an ear for the moment. Anna complimented David on his dedication to the firm. John added a toast to family, and David smiled with tired pride. I lifted my glass and sipped. The wine was dry on my tongue. I let my gaze rest on each of them in turn, memorizing their faces. Anna glowing with the smugness of a woman who believed she had fooled everyone. John pale, careful, with his eyes hiding behind sips of wine. David earnest, unaware, still wrapped in trust. And Emma, sweet Emma, her laughter cutting through the tension with innocence. Dinner began with plates passed hand to hand, and the clink of silverware filled the room. The warmth of the food contrasted with the cold determination in my chest. I tasted turkey and potatoes, nodded at compliments, laughed softly when Emma told a silly joke. On the outside, I was the picture of the grandmother enjoying her holiday. Inside, I counted the hours and minutes, each one carrying me closer to the moment when silence would end. After dessert was served, Anna leaned back in her chair, her hand brushing John's arm too casually to be accident. I watched the small exchange with calm clarity. She believed she had built her story so well that no one could shake it. But I had the papers, the photographs, the proof. The candles flickered, the plates emptied, and conversation drifted to plans for Christmas. I smiled politely, answering when spoken to, all the while feeling the storm in my chest, coiled and waiting. The room glowed with the illusion of peace, but I knew the truth lay heavy in my purse, ready to turn that peace into fire before the night was done. The candles on the table burned low as laughter drifted around me, but my ears caught only the uneven rhythm of forks against china and the faint hum of the furnace. Anna dabbed her lips with her napkin and rose with deliberate poise. She thanked everyone for being there, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, and her eyes gleaming with a glow that was more performance than sincerity. She said softly that she had something special to share, something that would make this Thanksgiving unforgettable. She paused long enough for the silence to build, then announced that she was expecting a baby. The room erupted with surprise. David sprang from his chair, his face alight with joy, and wrapped his arms around her. He kissed her hair, murmuring that this was the best gift he could ever receive. Emma clapped her hands, bouncing in her seat, delighted by the excitement, even if she did not understand. Across the table, John forced a smile, lifting his glass as if to toast, but his hand shook slightly, and I saw his throat tighten when he swallowed. I folded my napkin, slowly placed it beside my plate, and drew in a steady breath. My heart pounded, but my hands were calm. I reached for my purse, slid out the thick envelope, and laid it on the table. The sound of paper on wood cut through the chatter. Conversation stilled. I looked directly at Anna. My voice was quiet but strong. I told her she thought she could fool me, but I carried evidence that no smile or tear could erase. I opened the envelope and pulled out the first photograph. It showed her and John stepping into a hotel lobby together, his hand lightly brushing her arm, their faces unmistakable. David froze, his arm still around her waist. His eyes widened as he leaned forward to see the picture. He whispered her name, half question, half plea. Anna's face drained of color, her mouth opening, then closing again. I laid down another sheet, a hotel invoice dated the same weekend John had sworn to me he was in Baltimore. The charges included 2 nights a dinner at the attached restaurant and a bottle of wine delivered to the room. I placed it neatly beside the photograph. John's jaw tightened. He pushed his chair back slightly, but he did not speak. Next came the receipts, jewelry purchased from a shop downtown, flowers delivered to Anna's address, dinners at restaurants far from David's office. Each page landed with finality, the pile of truth growing heavier between us. Anna shook her head, muttering. It wasn't what it looked like, but her voice was brittle, cracking like glass under strain. David looked from her to the papers, his face pale, his body rigid as though every bone inside him had turned to stone. I reached for the phone records, pages of call logs, hundreds of conversations between John and Anna at hours that stretched deep into the night. I set them down carefully, the numbers lined in stark black ink. David's hand trembled as he touched one of the pages. His lips parted, but no words came. Then I brought out the bank statement. A transfer of $20,000 from John's retirement account to an unfamiliar name. I slid it forward and watched John's face darken, his mouth tightening, as if he could hold back everything by sheer force of will. The final set came from the divider marked clinic. I laid down photographs of Anna walking into the medical building, her coat wrapped tightly around her, her face turned away. Then the invoice printed clear as day, listing prenatal tests and an ultrasound. David stepped back from the table, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. His face was white, his breath ragged. He turned to his wife, then to his father, then to me. His voice, when it came, was rough and broken. He asked if this was true. Anna broke into sobs, clutching her napkin, shaking her head, but offering no denial. John lurched to his feet, his chair toppling behind him, his fists clenched at his sides. He tried to speak, but I raised my hand, and the words stuck in his throat. The front door opened then, and Patricia Harris stepped into the room, her coat over one arm, her briefcase in the other. She greeted me with a calm nod before turning her eyes to John. She said firmly that she was representing me and carried with her a petition for divorce already drafted. She explained in measured words that he could sign quietly, sparing further humiliation, or refuse, and face a contested battle in which every document on this table would become public. John's face flushed deep red, then drained to a sickly gray. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no sound emerged. Anna's sobs filled the silence, her shoulders shaking, mascara streaking down her cheeks. David stood still, his hands gripping the back of his chair, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes were fixed on the papers on the evidence of betrayal and deceit laid bare in black and white. Emma, sensing the tension, had gone quiet, her small hands clutching her fork. I slid the documents back into the envelope, folded it closed, and rested my hand on top. My voice did not tremble as I told them the truth has a way of surfacing no matter how carefully lies are wrapped. I said that tonight was the end of their charade. The candles flickered in the draft from the open door, casting shadows across faces that could no longer hide. The turkey on the table sat untouched, the pies forgotten, as the weight of betrayal pressed down on every soul in the room. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had known in 47 years of marriage. David's hand trembled as he set his wine glass down, his eyes locked on the papers Patricia had carried in. Anna wept into her napkin, her shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded hollow to me, more fear than remorse. John stood frozen, his jaw tight, his face shifting from red to gray, as if his body could not decide between anger and defeat. I sat still, my hand resting on the envelope of evidence, and breathed deeply. My work was done. The rest would be decided by the law and by time. The weeks that followed were filled with appointments and signatures. Patricia guided me through every form with a steady hand, explaining what each line meant, ensuring I understood exactly what I was securing. John contested at first, his pride pushing him to argue, but the mountain of evidence and the threat of public exposure silenced his protests quickly. In February, the divorce was finalized. The judge awarded me the house in Fairfax, the place where I had tended roses for years, and granted me the majority of our retirement accounts, along with the joint savings. John was left with what little he had managed to hide, and even that seemed like ashes in his hands. He walked out of the courthouse hunched and tired, a shadow of the man who had once stood so tall beside me. David filed for his own divorce soon after. His voice broke when he told me, yet there was no hesitation in his eyes. He said he could not raise Emma in a house poisoned by lies. The court granted him full custody, and Anna was given supervised visits only twice a month. I watched my son transform under the weight of betrayal into a father fierce with love and determination. He arranged his work schedule around Emma's school plays and soccer games. He brought her to my house often, and the sound of her laughter chasing through my halls healed wounds I had thought permanent. Anna did not stay in town for long. The neighbors who once waved at her now turned away when she walked down the street. At church, whispers followed her until she stopped attending altogether. Lisa Moore told me she saw her leaving one dawn, with suitcases crammed into the back of a borrowed car. Word spread that she was living with her parents in Richmond, a grown woman returned in disgrace. As for John, he tried to build a life with Anna in her temporary rental, but it crumbled quickly. His health declined. His once broad frame grew thin, his energy fading. Without the respect of the community or the comfort of a family to stand beside him, he looked older by the week. By spring, people said he shuffled like a man far beyond his years, worn down by regret and consequence. I did not gloat. Watching him collapse under the weight of his choices brought no joy. It only confirmed what I already knew, that betrayal carries its own punishment, heavier than any I could have given. Meanwhile, I carved a new life. I joined the women's club at the community center, where I found laughter among friends who had weathered their own storms. We shared stories, recipes, and encouragement. I volunteered at the local library, reading books to children whose wide eyes reminded me of Emma's. My mornings belonged to my garden. I pruned the roses, planted tulips, and pulled weeds with a satisfaction that ran deeper than ever before. Every Sunday, David and Emma came for dinner. Emma barreled into my arms the moment she arrived, chattering about school and friends. David brought flowers or a pie sometimes, nothing but a tired smile that softened when he sat at my table. We talked honestly now. The walls that Anna had built between us crumbled completely. Slowly, respect and closeness grew back stronger for having been tested. One evening in April, I sat on the porch with David after dinner sipping sweet tea while Emma played in the yard with a kite. The sunset painted the sky in orange and pink. David leaned back, his eyes fixed on his daughter, and said quietly that he was proud of me. He said my strength had saved not just me, but him and Emma too. His voice carried the kind of gratitude that sits deep in the chest. I placed my hand over his and told him I was proud of him as well. When night fell and I prepared for bed, I paused at the mirror. The woman staring back had gray hair and lines etched by years of laughter and grief, but her eyes held something unshakable. I remembered Anna's cruel words that I was too old to notice. I remembered John's arrogance, thinking I would accept his deceit. They had both been wrong. Now, with my house, my garden, and the love of my family intact, I felt stronger than I ever had. The pain was real, but so was the peace that followed. Justice had been served not by vengeance alone, but by clarity, patience, and truth. So let me leave you with this. Do not ever let anyone convince you that age makes you blind or powerless. Do not let betrayal silence you. Hold fast to your clarity, your dignity, and when you gather the evidence of truth, justice will follow. If my story has resonated with you, share your thoughts, stay with me, and remember that strength has no age and truth always rises.